Welcome to Dumas.
Now, I know all y'all don't know who it is because I just got here today. My hometown is a little town way down Dixie way. Now, everybody down there for miles around all calls me by my name. Now that I'm up here in your big city, I sure wish y'all would do the same. I'm a ding-dong daddy from Dumas, and you ought to see me do my stuff. Yes, a ding-dong daddy from the Dumas, and you ought to see me do my stuff. I'm a ping-pong papa from Pitchfork Prairie, ought to see me strut. I'm a ding-dong daddy, got a whiz-bang mama, she's a Bear Creek baby and a Wampus kitty. I'm a ding-dong daddy from Dumas, and you ought to see me do my stuff.
And good afternoon on your Tuesday. Gentleman Jim here with you on the 50s Dance Party. We're going to play a tune for you. Folks, stay tuned. I have a very important interview coming up. And Ken, you're doing research on the Shamrock Fire of 1956.
Yes, and we thought we needed to capture some of the small personal stories surrounding the event from the widows and the children and the relatives, the doctors, nurses, firemen, plant workers that were there. While these stories were still available to us because we've lost a lot of the people that were directly related to the fire at this point.
Well, Ken, we do appreciate it, and we'll try to help you get some folks to come out and give their personal experiences of that tragic day.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks to everybody for listening to us.
Well, the next morning when that fire alarm went, I thought, if he doesn't hear this alarm, I'm not going to wake him, and he heard it immediately. He just got right up and got his clothes on and left.
When they buried my dad, and you actually stood there and watched the casket go into the ground. When I realized he was going into the ground, that is when I remember crying hard.
There, of course, you could see the smoke and fire from the house. It took a long time to really come to the realization that this actually happened.
Our first aid man, Charlie Lummis, he was killed in it. And several of the foremen were killed that were down there trying to fight that thing. And 20 some odd, I think, were killed that day. Plus, I don't know how many more were burned.
Nearly everybody was volunteer.
I mean, they want to see them show us your scars, Granddaddy, you know, from all the grandkids and so forth. Tell us about how that happened.
That's the hardest thing that I've ever had to do in my life, was to go tell my mother that my dad had got killed.
I was lucky that I had my children to think about, because I wouldn't have wanted to have lived at all.
Well, I went through a bunch of fires out there, but that was the worst one.
So the only thing they found was my dad's work boots and his class I.
So they found your dad's hand out there today.
The shape those poor men were in was horrible. I've just never seen anything like it, and you never forget.
I did know I was burned pretty bad. Years later, I had heard that I was burnt so bad that they might not have expected me to make it.
It's a distillery, and they use heat to do it, and when you got a heat source, a combustion source, you know, you're going to have a problem. That's just all there is to it.
Of course, Shamrock denied it, but they said it had been, reported, but they just hadn't fixed it.
But I doubt very seriously if it had enough heat at 5:32 a.m. to have started these fires.
See, the tanks was on fire wood inside the refinery. So they could have let that tank burn out for 2 or 3 days.
I've carried the best of my father with me. He had a great happy-go-lucky spirit. And he was fun to be around. Let's make the most of this moment.
I dream a lot of times at night that I'd see him somewhere way off.
Better.
Thank you for having me here tonight. Paul Jenkins called and asked me if I'd come up, and I always want to be here when I can with all of you. And for those of you that don't know me, I'm Ken Floyd. I grew up in this town, and I was 13 when the 56 fire occurred. I was a spectator. We were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that's one of the reasons I'm up here. The second reason I'm up here is in 2008, my son-in-law and I decided to do a documentary of the 56 fire, and the things we saw and heard changed our lives. And we spent a year and a half of our time doing that, and it was a wonderful thing. Before we get started tonight, I want to bring somebody else up for you to see and talk to you a couple of minutes, because George Oaks, if you remember, is the youngest person who was burned in a fire. Now, if he keeps running about 6 miles a day, he's probably going to be the last one standing with scars on his back that saw the flames. So George, come up just a minute and share with us and I'll try to... 6 miles I'm down and I got tired driving over here. Thanks, sir. My name's George Oaks, and I grew up here in Dumas, son of Herman and Alice Oaks. I'm a proud graduate of Dumas High School, graduated in 1964. Proud member of a couple of high school state championship football teams too. Some of y'all remember that. July 29th, 1956, we woke up. Kenny lived across the street. Him and his dad, Mr. Floyd, we jumped in the car. My dad hollered at us. We just jumped in the car. We saw the smoke out of the plant that lives on the Elm Street. We headed out there, and that was the wrong thing to do. Got out there and the tank blew. We were out there on the highway, back then it went right by the plant. And when it blew, we took off running across the field. I didn't have a shirt on because I never wore a shirt in the summer when I was a kid. I had a pair of Levi's on and a pair of sandals. We went out there, ended up coming into the hospital. I spent 9 months at the hospital here in Dumas. Dr. Coventry was my doctor. Then I spent a month at John Seeley down in Galveston for more burn treatment. All I want to say is thank you to Dr. Coventry. I want to say thank you to the nurses, Frank Cheevers, gosh, the nurses, Smokey Campbell and Irene Louette. Oh gosh, I could go on and on. They just treated me wonderfully down there. They let me do whatever I wanted to do. I was 10 years old. And I could ride up and down the halls in my bike. Some of you that know me might remember that. They'd let my dog come up and see me. But I want to thank those guys. I want to thank Kenny and his son-in-law for the, memorializing this thing and coming up with that documentation so we won't ever forget it. I want to thank all these guys. Some of them, like Sam Gibson was my scout leader at that time. He was a Cub Scout leader. Of course, Mr. Milligan, Doug Milligan's dad, and we all knew him. Doug was in my class. And I knew all these, Donald Thompson, and I didn't know the guys from Sunray, but of course we all knew everybody from Dumas. It's a small town. We had a lot of funerals and stuff. Thanks to you guys for all the stuff y'all do still, and for memorializing this thing. I think you do it every year. Continue to do
Dumas too. I left him on. That was Mrs. Dumas taught, his wife taught English up at the high school. And his dad, Charlie Mack Dumas. Thanks also to my wife for having listened to these stories for all these years. Every life on it. Gets to listen. Okay, Kenny? Thank you. Do something maybe a little different than some of the speakers over the past have done tonight. Certainly want to start by this town meant a tremendous amount to me when I was growing up, a great amount to me when I was growing up. And if we think back at what this town was in the mid-50s and what Sunray was in the mid-50s, it was something very special. And of course, I always remember the rainstorms, which I hope we don't get for a few minutes here. And in '56, does anybody remember the snowstorm we got? That was a biggie, wasn't it? I remember our house was all the way up to the eave on the house. Walk around it like being in a tunnel. Hailstorms. I can remember working for an old farmer when he was about to cut wheat, and a hailstorm came through. And by the time he came through, he didn't have any wheat to cut. The only thing he had was a bottle of whiskey. Reached down under the floorboard for you. Yeah. And I remember dirt storms. I remember when you could turn the porch light on a house and not see it for more than 10 feet, and it was 10 o'clock in the morning. We'd have to go down to the old junior high and shovel the coach to get us to shovel the gym out, because the old Sylvania TV, watching the Ed Sullivan show, watching Elvis come on. Dad got so aggravated with it, he left the room, but I noticed my mother and sister stayed and watched it go. And the I Love Lucy, that was my favorite. But I remember also we had 2 channels. And when you change channels sometimes, we'd have to find a pipe wrench and go outside and put it on the TV antenna and turn it a little bit to get better reception. Listen to music, Morton Kramer on the piano I love, sleeping out in the backyard, kids playing football in the street, all those wonderful things. Being able to walk downtown in this town at night as kids. All the adults kept an eye on us. It was a great place for a kid to grow up. Cool summer nights, quiet summer mornings. Life here in Sunray seemed to be pretty simple, faith-based. There was a lot of respect between each other. Nobody had a lot of money, it didn't seem like. Or at least none trickled down to me. Everybody was trying to raise their kids and make ends meet. And we spent a lot of family FaceTime with our moms and dads. At church, sports, around the table at night, watching TV, working around the house doing chores. I remember the several plants in the area, and they created a lot of good paying jobs for everybody. We knew a lot of the policemen, and we knew a lot of the firemen, and they kept us safe. And I remember the 56 fire that we all did. As we gather here tonight, in front of this memorial, to honor these men, I'd like to ask a question, and that is, what would these fine men have us remember of them when we pass by this memorial? Tonight, what do they want us to take away? They came from all walks of life. They were volunteer firemen, plant workers, but they came from all walks of life. Some were Shamrock employees in construction, safety, manufacturing, patrolmen, roustabouts, electricians, engineers, shift workers. Some were businessmen, some had freight companies, retail furniture, supply companies. Some were city employees. There was a fire marshal and men who worked for the water department. Some worked for large corporations like natural gas pipelines, Southwest Public Service, North Plains Telephone, and Panhandle Eastern. They were active in their community, Lions Club, Doggy Days. They were active in Cub Scouts, Boy Scouts, Eagle Scout advisors, baseball coaches, They were hardworking men who you could count on. They would lend a helping hand to their neighbor. They were family men, good husbands and fathers who taught their kids, taught us through their actions. They spent a lot of time with their kids. And besides this, most of these men up here were firemen. The size of the Dumas department back then was about 42, maybe 30 active and 42 members on the roll. The size of Sunray, I think, was 15 to 20 at that time, something like that. Clayton Mills said that the requirements to be a fireman in Dumas or Sunray was you had to be recommended by another member of the fire department. You had to show that they paid their debts, or you paid your debts. You had to have high morals. You had to be physically fit. You had to be employed, and you had to be a quality person. That's a pretty high bar. And at that time, before 1956, when these were first, when these fire departments were first developed, there was no compensation at all. At the time of the 56 fire, these men received $2 to hook up a big hose in the city of Dumas or Sunray. And if it was a night fire, they received another $2. The cities paid for this. The cities did not pay for fire outside of the city and the county. In this case, the firemen were paid by a fund that received income from activities such as, does anybody know? The snow cone man at Doggy Days. Snow cones booth at Doggy Days, selling snow cones. The county usually would pay, the city owned all the trucks, so the county would usually pay about $50 for the trucks when they came out to reimburse for the trucks. These men went to the fires because they were public spirited and wanted to help their community. That's why they went. The firehouse was not big enough to store everything back in those days. These guys, probably 80% of them to 90% of them, had been issued bunker suits, heavy trousers and heavy coats, and they had their fire hats. Since the firehouse wasn't big enough for all that equipment, where did they keep it? The trunk of their car. It was in the trunk of their car. And at that time, when they went to a fire, it was not mandatory that they suit up in those bunker suits. They received local training during monthly meetings. Some went to College Station for fire training, but none had received training for pressurized tanks in a tank field, such as Tank 199 at the Shamrock refinery. These firemen were special people back then, and now. They protect our lives, our homes, our businesses, our property, and around here also our crops. They're always serving at community events and fundraisers. They're always on call, hurrying to the scene, not knowing exactly what they're going to expect when they get there. They have to make decisions on the spot. They bravely have each other's backs. We think that tonight we should remember the common denominator between these plant employees and these firemen was how they lived their life. Also, they both worked in dangerous environments. Shamrock back then was a dangerous environment. And on July the 29th, 1956, they were all active as firemen. The second thing, and probably the most important to them over the 60 years, is that we would remember their families. They were so proud of their families and so proud of their kids. And their families have paid a tremendous cost over the years since the fire. There was 19 widows. All but one had children. Glasses. 19 widows, all but one had children. Goodness. 39 children. The ladies were in shock. There was a lack of closure. I know Miss Lily told me the story of rushing to the hospital to see Linwood, and it was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever heard in my life. The doctor said when she came in, don't touch him, don't get near him, because of infections. The first thing Derwin said is, give me a big kiss. And she did. The doctor said kiss him. So what happened? I think Derwood was the last one to die. Is that right? So what happened during that time was Miss Lily got to say goodbye to this wonderful man. And this man got to say goodbye to her. That was wonderful. The flip side of that may have been Harriet Dunn, who waited all day long for word as to what had happened to her husband. Late evening time, they came around and told her. We went to Wyoming to see her. She's a wonderful lady. She came down here for the 56 fire. There was funerals for these ladies to handle. There were settlements with attorneys. There was consoling the children. What to do next? Where do we live? How do we get help with these kids? They moved forward with support from this community, Sunray and Dumas. They formed a support group made up of the widows. That was wonderful because in actuality the widows were the only ones that could relate to the other widows as to what had happened. They hugged each other, they cried with each other, and they always met on July 29th. But when everybody went home and the kids were in bed asleep, they were alone with their thoughts. Harriet Dunn was one of the youngest of the widows. Her husband, Billy Joe, was only 25 years old. The night we had at the high school auditorium, we showed the 56 Fire documentary. Harriet came up to me and put her arms around me, and she gave me this little book. It's called Words of Wisdom. And it was a book that when she saw something that could help her through the day, she would write it down. And she said, Ken, I want you to take this. I don't think I need it. And when I opened this and started reading it, one thing this recorded is never forget what is worth remembering, or remember what is best forgotten. There's some parts of the fire it's best forgotten. But the memory of this, the memories of the widows, the memories of the children, that's what we want. Another one, what lies behind us and lies before us are tiny matters compared to what lies within us. That sounds like Ralph Waldo Emerson, doesn't it? When it hurts to look back and you're scared to look ahead, you can look beside you and your best friend will be there. I cherish this. The other thing that showed me something when we were doing those interviews is the women that had been remarried, the absolute respect their husbands showed when we were talking about this. I mean, they felt it. They did. The children, 39. Some were old enough they had to tell their moms. Came out and got them off a tractor in the field. They had to go tell their moms what had happened. Some were old enough they had to console their moms. Some young ones consoled their moms. Most were devastated. Little girls who had lost the love of their life. Boys who had lost their hero and pal. Some were too young to ever remember their dads. At least one hadn't been born yet. And there's the brothers and the sisters and the parents. These guys here would also have you remember their fellow firemen and plant workers that were burned. Some of these guys felt lucky to be alive that had been burned. They'd been severely burned. But they had no idea of the ramification of their burns when they were in the hospital. Man, they kept their spirits up. They were still banded together, just like a bunch of firemen. You see them today, they band together and they help each other out. They've got each other's backs. They support each other. And that's the way they were in the hospital. The stay was lengthy, but they weren't ready for those bandages to come off, because when those bandages came off, they knew that was it for life. That's what they were going to carry them for life. Not only the physical, but the emotional. These heroes would have us remember the responders, all the other plant employees that came in, all the other fire departments from the other towns, the doctors, the funeral homes. And they would also have you remember the community. Sometimes when things get real bad and tragic and dark, it kind of gets hard to see God sometimes. You kind of lose it. You think, well, why? Well, this community showed God. They were here for the families, the widows and the children. They were here to help with meals, helping with the funerals. All the friends, the fellow workers, fellow firemen always take care of their own. There was a Dumas Sunray Disaster Relief Fund. That was raised by the firemen in Texas, all over the state of Texas. They sent a check to Sunray for $20,913. They sent a check to Dumas for $18,299. That's what firemen think of helping each other, right? Donations from firemen all over the state. Example of how serving and caring that firemen are. A brotherhood of special people. The tragedy. Just after the fire and through the years, there was a certain quietness about all the details of the fire and the cause of the explosion. I can't tell you how many people we interviewed that couldn't tell us what had happened at the plant. But now a lot has been written and learned about what happened on that Sunday morning in 1956. A lot of memories of the fire have been recorded. A lot of articles in the press over the years. A lot of speakers have stood right here on an annual basis and talked to you. After the fire, there was an exhaustive report done by a DC firm that pretty well spelled out most of what had happened, and it was never released. And it still hasn't been released to those families. There's articles from Fire World. There are still things we don't know for sure, and that was, why was there pentane in the dike area of tank 199 that morning? The thing we are sure about is the ignition source was an open heater down at an asphalt tank. These firemen were not prepared to enter this tank farm other than in the type of person they were. They did not have training on this pentane tank, on a pressurized tank. Very few people understood in the country, the whole country, how to fight a fire like this. Some of them didn't have their personal protection on. There wasn't a good location close enough to the tank for a water source. And the states fire got in very fast was beyond what they understood. It's easy to say that looking back, but they were there, and there was no one else to do it. So they got to work doing what they thought was best. They made a decision. They were tough, proud, independent men. They were dependent on each other, brave and invincible. I better speed up. I see some lightning over there. Going into the tank farm to fight that tank was an impossible task because a couple of things happened that they didn't know might happen. One, the tank collapsed. The second was the vapor. The fire went out and the vapor was expelled for 700 feet. And then it reignited when oxygen came back into the air. So the people that were running were saturated with that vapor when the second ignition hit. Years later, I watched TV one morning as two planes flew into the World Trade Center. And firemen just like these were rushing up the stairs to save people. The structure failed. Nobody thought that structure would fail, and we watched it on TV. That reminded me so much of seeing that old Pentine tank fold back like an onion, and that mushroom cloud come up out of it. One thing that these guys also would be so proud of is the safety requirements that came out of it. I know you've heard this before, that everything that went wrong that day, there was a safety rule that made it right. Spray system on all pressurized tanks to keep it cool and prevent rupture. Personnel would be removed to 1,000 feet from a fire. They would be wearing protective clothing. Relocation of direct fire heaters in the tank field. No cast iron equipment should be employed for pumps, casing, valves, pipes, or line fittings. Adequate fire mains in the tank farms. Pump placed outside of the dike, no longer inside the dike. A study showed that depending on the degree of flame development, that a pressure storage tank like this could explode within 10 minutes. Some 51 years later, when my son-in-law and I decided to make a documentary of this, while there were people still to be interviewed, all of you remember sharing with us the things that probably were some of the deepest, darkest things and memories in such a loving, wonderful, outpouring way, showing us keepsakes and pictures. You cried, they cried, we cried. We could see the faith, hope, and strength that they had found to go forward. And everybody always immediately asked about others. How are they doing? Where are they? Oswald Chambers once said that you always know the person who has been through the fires of sorrow and received themselves, because you're always certain you can go to them in trouble and they will have ample time for you. I've never seen so much love come out of so many emotional and physical scars. My memory of the Panhandle are based on the strength of the people here. It's been 60 years now since the fire. Sometime in the not so far future, all the widows and the men burned and the eyewitnesses will be gone. Then all the children will be gone. Then the unbearable, unthinkable grief and tears that were shed will be harder for future generations to comprehend. Mr. Broxton had a dream about his father. He seemed very far away and he couldn't see his face clearly. In some ways, the fire's going to be like that shortly for us. We know now that life is more fragile than we like to think. So what would these heroes have us remember about them? The love poured out and the tears shed by the families and the entire community speaks to the kind of men they were and the contribution to the heritage of Moore County they made. These men's lives were not defined by the 56 fire. They had already done that the way they lived and loved and practiced their faith and had a passion to serve their communities. They gave their lives by bravely responding to a fire in the only way they knew how. They took on the responsibility.
The first Christmas, we had a Christmas party with a Santa Claus in Sunray, I guess at their community building. There was 33 children there that had lost their father. Holidays were always hard for that first year or two.
At that point, I remember letting go of my grandfather's hand and running.
We went up there and waited and still couldn't find out anything. You kept getting all these rumors, but you didn't know what really had happened.
Just waited all day, and they never could find him.
It was just like I say, it affected almost everybody in the county some way.
But 19 men in this little town, they weren't ready to handle it. But they got ready.
I never did hear what was the cause of the fire. I mean, it was this one tank, I understand, it was on fire, and then they were all in there amongst the tanks fighting this tank when there's another one or two exploded and trapped them all.
We women just got really close.
She's been an amazing woman to do what she's done.
Every year it just comes back to me on the 29th. No matter where I am, it does. I didn't know it at the time, but I was lucky that I had my children to think about, because I wouldn't have wanted to have lived at all.